So the pituitary gland is what we call the master gland of the endocrine system. And it is called the master gland because it controls essentially most other functions of the endocrine system. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this video for you. So we think about where the pituitary gland is. It's contained right within the base of the cranium, underneath the cerebellum, as you can see from this image here. And just to put that into a little bit more context to help you see, I'm going to use the Biodigital Human app that I've shown you before, just to give you a wee bit more context. So we're looking at, to be fair, a rather creepy looking head there. But if we were to try and look at the pituitary gland, first of all, we'd need to remove the bones on the top of the skull. So they're the parietal bones and the frontal bones, and that would show us the brain underneath. And if we just spin him round, so we're looking straight down onto the top of his head. And then we're going to remove the brain so we can see what's underneath it. So if we take out the nervous system, and now we can see the base of the cranium. And in here, if we zoom in a little bit, there's a bone called the sphenoid bone, and you're going to learn more about the anatomy of the head and neck in your oral biology module, in which point you'll learn all the different bones of the cranium. But this sort of funny looking, we call it a butterfly bone, is the sphenoid bone, and right in the middle is an area called Seletive or the pituitary fossa, and that's where the pituitary gland sits. So if we put his face up again, you can see it's sort of right in the middle and above and in between the eyes in the pituitary gland fossa, and it then releases its hormones from there to be spread throughout the body like the rest of the endocrine system. Although we refer to the pituitary gland as the master gland of the endocrine system, it in itself is controlled by the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is part of the brain, therefore it's the nervous system, but it's very specific in its role in that it is to control the output of all the rest of the endocrine system. So the pituitary is the master gland of the endocrine system, but the hypothalamus has ultimate control, but it isn't technically part of the endocrine system. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to build up our understanding of the pituitary gland, of the hormones it secretes, and of the functions they play. And in order to do that, I'm going to build a mind map with you. And it's entirely up to you with how you use mind maps and how they work for you. I know we've done a few already. What I'd like to do in this one is I'm going to put some images in it, because sometimes having a picture will help you remember things. It's just another process that we can try. So the pituitary gland is split into two lobes, and we call it the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Because the anterior sits towards the front of the pituitary fossa, and the posterior sits towards the back. And they produce different hormones. So let's look at the anterior lobe first. We're not necessarily looking at every single hormone that the pituitary gland produces, okay? They're not all particularly relevant to us. It's a very, very complex topic, endocrinology in the whole. So we're just keeping this as simple as we can to help us understand the body functions. So the hormones, there's 5 hormones that we're going to look at produced by the anterior lobe. And the first hormone we're going to look at is growth hormone. And growth hormone is pretty straightforward. It is what it says on the tin. It regulates our growth throughout life, which is what I'm going to depict with this picture here. Obviously, there's times in our lives when we grow more than others, and therefore we have more of this hormone than other times. So clearly, we have most growth hormone in childhood. It does act on all our tissues, but predominantly the biggest effects of growth hormone are on muscle and bone tissue. The second hormone that we're going to talk about in the anterior lobe is called thyroid stimulating hormone. Which is abbreviated to TSH. Now, there's a number of hormones secreted by the pituitary gland, that serve to act on other glands of the endocrine system, and thyroid stimulating hormone is one of them. And as the name would suggest, what the TSH or thyroid stimulating hormone does is it acts on the thyroid to produce its secretions. And we'll talk about the thyroid gland later, and I'm going to ask you to do a bit of research on that yourself. It produces two hormones, but what thyroid stimulating hormone does is it encourages the thyroid to develop and grow as we develop through childhood, and then once fully developed, it stimulates the thyroid activity as and when we require it. The next hormone produced by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland has a pretty complicated name. It's called Adrenocorticotropic Hormone. But for the ease of what we're doing here, we're going to use its abbreviated name, which is ACTH, so Adrenocorticotropic Hormone. And this is another one of these hormones that acts on another part of the body, another organ of the endocrine system to stimulate and release its secretions. And what it acts on is the adrenal cortex. Now, the adrenal glands are found, we have two, and they're found on the top of each of the kidneys. What the adrenal glands do, you're going to research yourself, but ACTH from the pituitary gland causes the adrenal glands to produce their secretions. So it detects their surrounding environment and tells the adrenal glands when they're required. The next hormone I want to talk about is called prolactin. And prolactin acts on the breast tissue, and it helps stimulate the production of breast milk during pregnancy. So obviously this is a hormone that would only be found in women. And it allows the body to produce breast milk, and it also, after the baby is born, but also during pregnancy, it allows the breast tissue to develop into a state where it's able to produce breast milk as and when it's required. So it's a very, very specific hormone that you would only find in women. And then the last hormones that we're going to talk about from the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland are actually a group of hormones. They're called gonadotropins. And these are what were probably better known as the sex hormones. And they're produced by the pituitary gland with the aim of encouraging our reproductive organs to develop just before and during puberty. The glands that produce the actual hormones that are required for our reproductive process are the ovaries and the testes, but the gonadotropins produced by the pituitary gland help those organs develop into a form where they're usable for us for their reproductive purpose. So just to recap then, those 5 hormones that we're looking at for the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland are growth hormone that stimulates and regulates growth throughout childhood, thyroid stimulating hormone which stimulates the thyroid to produce its secretions, ACTH or adrenocorticotropic hormone which stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce its secretions, prolactin, which is a hormone found in women that encourages the development of breast tissue to produce breast milk. And then finally, the group of hormones known as gonadotropins, which stimulate the maturation of the sex organs in order to produce their particular hormones as well. So if we move on then to look at the posterior lobe of the pituitary, we're just looking at 2 hormones here. And the first one is called oxytocin. And oxytocin is another hormone that's specific to female. And what oxytocin does is it works in 2 ways, and it relates to childbirth and breast milk production. So in the predominant role that it serves is it causes the uterine contractions that allow childbirth to happen. It also, however, acts on breast tissue in order to help breast milk be expelled through the process of breastfeeding. So basically it makes the tissues contract both in the uterus and the breast tissue. Oxytocin is also related to our mood, and it helps with mother-baby bonding, and prolactin also plays a role in that as well. And then the last hormone that we're going to look at for the pituitary gland, and it's produced by the posterior lobe, is called antidiuretic hormone. An antidiuretic hormone is produced to act on the kidneys, and it ultimately controls our urine output. And it does it in a number of ways. When we talked about the kidney in the previous session on the digestive system, we talked about something called selective reabsorption. So if you remember, in the nephrons of the kidney, in the glomerulus, so in the bundle of capillaries, a lot of the fluid is pushed out of the blood into the Bowman's capsule and then the convoluting tubule that runs along. And in that tubule, the body makes a decision about whether it wants the fluid that's in there or whether it doesn't. And one of the things that help the body decide that is antidiuretic hormone. So basically, the pituitary gland is scanning the fluid levels within blood. And if it feels that it needs more fluid in the blood, then it will increase the antidiuretic hormone, which will reduce the loss of fluid. And it does that by increasing the amount of water that's reabsorbed in that convoluting tubule of the nephron. So by doing that, it reduces our urine output. And it does that by increasing the selective reabsorption in the nephron of the kidney. Okay. So for the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, we've just got the two hormones to think about. Oxytocin, which is involved in uterine contractions and childbirth, and then antidiuretic hormone, which reduces our urine output to therefore increase our blood fluid levels. So you can see we're talking about 7 different hormones here, and they all work in different ways, but they're all controlling processes throughout our body. And if any of these hormones were missing, it would have really huge overarching effects on our body. So now you're going to go on and research the various other endocrine glands in the body and their secretions and what they do. And you'll find with all of them, they're all really vital to our body to be able to perform its functions in the way it's supposed to. And there are a number of the conditions that arise if we have problems with our endocrine system. And those are the type of things you're going to talk about next year in human disease. So it's really important you understand at this stage a basic knowledge of what the endocrine glands are, where they're found, and what their secretions do at a basic level. And then you'll have a much better ground basis to be able to understand what happens in disease processes.